Western democracies coming out of the bay and heading into open ocean. It's not going to sink. We're not going to sink. But the conditions are going to be different. It's going to be bumpier. It's going to be stormier. We're going to have to be more imaginative and more resilient about dealing with a journey like that. That's very different to being moored in the bay in relative safety, as, Western democracies have been for the most part throughout, let us say, the 1990s and the early noughties. And what's really important is that we don't either panic about this situation as though it's the end of the world, because democracies are very, very wonky at the moment, and they're on a negative trend in the West, but they're also more resilient than many of us imagine. So it's not the end of the world. But at the same time, just as we shouldn't catastrophize this situation, we also shouldn't just daydream as though we're still in the bay when we're not. And in fact, it's not just we've left the bay, we don't have a way of getting back into the bay. Certainly in the lifetime, I would guess, of anybody who is an adult now, we might not get back there, if ever. So that's where we're looking at the moment. And it's out of this that we get to our first really, really important question from Dan. So let me find it. And Dan says, Vlad, how can you really know that Western democracy is on a path of irreversible decline? You really know that if you've got a crystal ball? I mean, you might well be correct that Western democracy is in irreversible decline, but you might be completely wrong. What that comment says is something that we risk having in our hearts and minds, because it's a very easy confusion to arrive into. And it's also potentially dangerous. We shouldn't be sort of hypersensitive here. What one or two of us think is not that dangerous, really. But it becomes dangerous if we're having a big public conversation. We're talking about thousands and millions of people being just confused about this whole bay versus ocean business. So let's get into it. First of all, here is what I'm not saying at all when I say that we're leaving the bay and that departure from the bay might go better or worse for us, that we're not going to sink, but that leaving the bay is irreversible, Here's what I'm not saying when I'm saying that. I'm not saying that there is some kind of a law of history that is conditioning this. So we have spoken many times about what we've called teleology on the channel. These are ideas of history as progress. So that's the sort of stuff that Francis Fukuyama came up with, for instance, in the late 80s and early 90s, where he said that we were tending, if not trending, toward species-wide civilization converging on a kind of model of democratic capitalism. We're not postulating anything like that or anything that is a kind of a negative version of that we are regressing according to some inevitable patterns that come out of some kind of features of human politics or features of human irrationality and so on. No. What we are doing is we are making an historical and cultural judgment. That's to say, we are in this moment in history, and that's what the texture of that moment is. Think of it like, and this is a bad analogy, but it's not a completely terrible analogy, so let's just use it. Think of it as us diagnosing that our democracies, not all of them, but many and most of them perhaps, have a chronic illness. And, if we're the doctor, we have to conceptualize that chronic illness a bit. We have to say, well, it's real. We don't know if the patient will die, will live for a very long time. We don't know if the trend will be a bit better than we might expect or a bit worse than what we might expect. But we do know there's a chronic illness there. And we can't just say what, in effect, this comment says, which is, let's wake up tomorrow and see. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. We have to recognize that there is a condition there and that our resources for curing it are not available. We have plenty of resources to manage the illness. We have plenty of resources to make it less bad than it might be, but we have no way of getting the patient to wake up next week, let's say, and wake up without the illness. So where could this prejudice be coming from? Our tendency to sort of say, well, you can never know. Maybe we will just be in the bay in 5 years. Let's not be pessimistic. I think that there is actually a prejudice out there, which I'm certainly not going to ascribe to Dan, but I will ascribe it to the majority of comments that look like Dan's. And that's what I call the kind of ebb and flow prejudice. So just like there is a tendency in some parts of our hearts and minds to think in a progressive way about history, as though it's going towards some kind of end point, there's also a tendency to think of our democracy as self-correcting, which is to say, okay, it might not be traveling into any kind of progressive direction, but it has a kind of way of just correcting itself. And that inspires us to see people who come up in our politics, who we are very scared by because they stand against democratic value and democratic process, as aberrations. And we say, oh, wow, look at that political movement or event. What a bad aberration that is. It's such an outbreak of whatever it is, irrationality or ill human motives and so on. And we kind of say, well, eventually democracy sort of recalibrates itself. So this is what I call the kind of ebb and flow prejudice, that there's a sort of soft self-correcting mechanism in democracy. Now, if you ask people literally, do you believe this? Most people will say no. But actually, most Western citizens have believed this. And that's why it's very difficult for them to realize that their democracy does not have to be there. They realize it at a logical level. Yeah, democracy is here today. Could it be gone in 60 years? Yeah, sure. My society might not be democratic in 60 years. That's completely possible. It might be like Russia. Possible. But while we acknowledge that as a logical possibility, we still basically are in denial of it. We kind of think of our democracies as being out of time to a certain extent. They're just there. And eventually they will just recalibrate themselves into a pattern of sustenance that in the end can't be permanently broken. And so that's a prejudice I want to get rid of. And then, of course, there is something else. And that's the idea that you can't ever really know, as a thought that's a pattern that you find in scientific societies about non-factual knowledge. There is a trend in our society to say, look, but how do you know? But how do you know that that's what Shakespeare meant in this line? But how do you know that Beethoven's Last Piano Sonata expresses the cessation of time? But how do you know what Susan felt yesterday when she was at the party? Because you can't get inside her head. But how do you know that this book of history is better than that book of history? So there's a tendency to say that there's a kind of unknowability about non-factual knowledge in a scientific society, but there quite certainly can be plenty of knowledge that's not factual knowledge, that's knowledge about our societies. Now, a few weeks ago, we zinged Noam Chomsky for confusing things that might be true with things that are obviously true. So is what I am saying obvious? Is it obvious that 5 years from now, Western democracy will be in a less good place on the whole than it is today? Is this obvious? No and yes. It's not obvious in the sense that you can be a highly sophisticated, extremely knowledgeable, extremely reflective, extremely well-read individual and not see this. But that would mean that you're somebody who isn't specializing in politics or somebody who doesn't have a great talent for perceiving political reality. But to somebody who is a student of politics and is a decent student of politics, it's obvious. And it's obvious because it's not close. The patterns are so clear. The trends are so clear. The crisis of trust in public institutions we're living through is so clear. Our solutions, which we will talk about, for democratic regeneration, which are to do with improving our informational environment, improving the quality and dynamism of local politics. Many other tricks available. All of these tricks are really useful and will make our world better, but they're not going to simply solve the problem if we implement them. That, I do believe, is obvious, and it is an obvious truth that we are going to be in a worse place with our democracies 5 years from now than we are today. And that's why we've got to have conversations about this, so that we don't freak out, but also so that we don't fall into denial. And again, I do think it's been this sort of subtle line underneath a lot of the content on the main channel that we've said in a kind of implicit way, look, it's only if we stop denying that our democracy is in irreversible decline, not terminal decline, but irreversible decline, that we will be able to look with eyes wide open at our possibilities for averting the collapse of our democracies. Dan, if you've watched this, I appreciate that you've allowed me to dance around like this on top of your comment. I'm grateful for this, because I think this is something that is so important, because it's the natural thing. It's the natural thing for us to put into our hearts and minds that, you know what's this business of leaving the bay? You could just wake up and it'll be fine. We'll be in the bay again. No. Our second question comes from very many people who were worried about the concept of ethical responsibility that I attributed to all Russians in my last video on the main channel, where we said that even the Russians who are protesting against the war have some ethical responsibility for it. And indeed, I even said that I, having never lived in Russia or been a Russian citizen except for the Soviet period, that I have a microscopic amount of responsibility for that war. So this was asked by, let us see, Apsoy Pioke. This was asked by Ipsum. This was asked by Tokiomi. This was asked by Annie. Hello, dear Annie, and many others. So what I wanted to do with that concept is really three things. I wanted the concept to be an ethical concept that would be an inviting ethical concept, an ethical concept that was inviting people to reflect on their, economy of ethical sentiment, and then acknowledge some things in that economy that were to do with, being ethically part of the story, even if you were opposing the particular decisions made, the particular regime that's running your politics and so on. The second thing I wanted was that I wanted a political concept that was simple enough. I didn't want some kind of a 3-word technical term, which is why I just went for responsibility. Because political concepts need to be the sort of thing that can be thrown about like a football, with quite a bit of violence, without losing their shape. And responsibility is one such term. It's already a term we use. And I think it's a term that instinctively a large minority of people, and maybe even a majority, already in their minds distinguish from guilt. So people sense the difference between guilt by association, which is normally a bad thing, and responsibility by association, which is not normally a bad thing. But the key element was the third element behind what I wanted to do with that concept. And that's that I wanted what a lot of my colleagues in moral philosophy would call no-fault moral responsibility. So let's take an example of what that might be. Imagine that I am driving a car at below the speed limit, and that I strike a child, and that the child's life is altered as a result of the accident. But imagine that I was driving very carefully, very intentionally. Everything I was doing both within the remit of the law and with great care, but that it was just impossible for me to avert what happened because the kid just jumped from behind the car, behind the parked car, and I hit him. How am I going to feel? Well, I'm going to feel very ethically compromised here. I might not sleep all the night, and I might stay awake feeling some regret, some remorse, and feeling a lot of responsibility, even though at the level of good intent there is nothing that I did that was wrong, and at the level of care and not being reckless, there is nothing that I did wrong. So what I'm saying is that it would be a special kind of superficial evasion of the complexity of how we go with our emotional lives, to say that I'm being irrational when I'm staying up through the night and feeling regretful and holding what happened, holding that accident that changed the life of that extremely young human being, you know? So that's an example of no fault responsibility. What you couldn't do in that case is blame me for it, you know? And that's what I was wanting from that concept. I wanted a concept which said, look, let's not blame, obviously, the oppositional political activists in Russia for the war. That would be absurd. Let's not say they're guilty of anything. But are they responsible? Yeah. And how are they responsible? They're responsible the way even I am, which is to say that we are associated, we are part of a culture, they more than me, because I'm also quite a Western sort of entity now. But a part of me is Russian, and by association, I'm in this. I'm in this because I'm part of a culture that's over many, many decades failed to get its politics right. And it's because it failed to get its politics right that neighbors get invaded. So an ethical concept that's politically useful. And number 3, I wanted it to be a kind of a no blame, no fault type of idea of moral responsibility. Monique asks, what about Ukrainians going for that Crimean bridge or just firing onto Russian territory? How do we understand this? How do we balance this? Well, look, the central thing here is for Ukraine to maintain strong Western support. And notice that Ukraine's got quite strong Western support wasn't inevitable. It could have been otherwise. Zelensky could have, instead of having a blind, had a bad opening week or two with the war. In fact, he could have not just done some unwise actions. He could have just made statements that would have put people off. And you would have then seen citizen support and citizen pressure in Western societies, citizen pressure on governments to do more, dissipate and not even emerge properly. And that would have created a very different situation where many of us would have just felt, well, this is again some kind of skirmish in the ex-Soviet bloc, and we'll take a side moderately, but just preferably just should stay out of it. And Zelensky, in fact, didn't have a blinder running up to the war. In fact, let's make this very clear. Almost everybody watching this has no idea about Zelensky's domestic politics. In fact, you don't know whether he's a good or a terrible politician. And certainly in the run-up to the war, he was having a mixed time. If I were Ukrainian and I heard Zelensky imply days before the war that Ukraine may need to look at getting nuclear weapons, I wouldn't have been happy. And I wouldn't have been happy if I were a Ukrainian citizen and I was getting the level of communication I was getting from the Ukrainian government on the 22nd and 23rd of February. I would have been outraged. In my view, the government under-communicated dramatically with its citizens. And if I were in Kiev, then I would have been wondering, what do we do? Should, young people and children be sent out into other European countries, into the countryside? Do I need a helmet, a bulletproof jacket? Do I need a weapon? What should I expect? Where do I go in case of this or that happening? What will the first hours of the war be like if it happens? How should I set my expectations? There was a bit of a communicative vacuum, I felt, that nobody really knows about, because everybody's understanding of Ukraine flows from the time the war started. And since then, I think the communication has been sensational from Zelensky. So Zelensky did not have to do so brilliantly. He could have said terrible things about how he wants, all Russians to be, gone off the face of the earth. He could have done and talked about firing onto Russian territory and potentially killing Russian civilians, which would have put off Western democratic citizenships very, very fast from supporting Ukraine. He could have talked about and been behind some systemic, ghastly treatment of Russian prisoners of war. All of that could have just put people off. So the key thing about Ukraine weighing up how far to escalate and how far to push their luck, if they get to a military position where they're able to push their luck because they've got the Russians, pinned back to a good degree, out of many of the territories they've taken. If it goes well for Ukraine, well, then there would be more of these questions. How do you draw this line? But the key thing is that Ukraine cannot do any of this without Western support. And so Ukraine can't take any actions that are going to put off Western governments and above all Western citizens. That's the key equation for them, I think, Monique, as they'll be deciding this. Jan asks, what's the business with conservatives in the West being opposed to helping Ukraine? Why are some conservatives in that kind of position? Well, I think that there are different reasons. The first reason is that, and this is the least important reason, I think, is that there are people who are simply scared of nuclear war, and they're thinking that over-helping Ukraine increases the risk of nuclear war. The second reason is really that Ukraine has become a pawn in American, particularly culture wars. And that's not just true on the right, it's true on the center, it's true on the left too. And on the left, you see folks like Aaron Mate tweet about Ukraine, and Aaron's tweets are typically not about Ukraine when they're about Ukraine. They're about their gambits in an American culture war. And there are different conflicts going on. One of them is about the permissibility of politically incorrect and alternative views on Ukraine in the culture, and the feeling a lot of people have that these views aren't adequately permitted because they're treated as not just wrong, but a kind of taboo. And so people make that argument, but they're making an argument really about local culture war, and Ukraine is just an excuse for that argument to occur. And that's really true and important to acknowledge, whatever view you take of any issue about Ukraine, actually, as a first-hand problem we've got to think about. But this is not a first-hand problem we're thinking about when we're doing these culture wars. So that's the second phenomenon. It's there. The third phenomenon is the most, I think, dangerous one. And that's when there's genuine sympathy toward Vladimir Putin. And I want to make a controversial statement now that I really believe in, unfortunately. If Vladimir Putin is in office in 5 years, is a prediction I'm making, he will be more popular in the West in 2027 than he is in 2022. And already today, if you ran a poll and people were being honest, people in Western countries would rate Putin more favorably than many of their local political leaders. This channel at the moment, and the main channel, we're very low at the moment on these kinds of views being expressed. But as our conversation continues, we will notice more and more such views being expressed in the comments. They're very popular views on the internet. And they're real. And they express what I think Anne Applebaum has revealed in her last book, which is that there's the right, the conservative side, which is committed to institutions, constitutions, and democratic procedure. And there's the right that is little by little, even in the way that can seem imperceptible, even to the people doing this themselves, giving up on democratic procedure, democratic institutions, constitutions. So this is the unconstitutional right, as it were. And the unconstitutional right is growing. Now, what about at this point, please? I'm speaking to all of us, because yes, there's huge problems on all kinds of views on our political, in our political umbrella. But I'm saying that something is specifically a pathology on the right. It's a very dangerous pathology, that people on the right are now separating into those who believe in democracy and those who don't. And those who don't is a growing camp, and it'll be bigger in 2030 than it is today. That's part of the democratic decline story. And these people are soft sympathizers with Putin. Again, are they really sympathizing with Putin? Do they really understand what Putin is, what he's doing? No, they don't know anything about him. He is just, again, a kind of image that they feel sympathetic toward, and they sort of project onto him various different things. But that's absolutely happening, and it's happening among that group of people who have given up on democracy, and many of them don't even know that they have. And that's why for us it's absolutely critical when we look at people on the right or on the hard right even to say, is this person committed to democracy or not? No matter how far I agree or disagree with them about taxation, about the role of the state, about healthcare. Because our conversations about healthcare are conversations about improving our societies. Our conversations about democracy are conversations about really stopping our societies from collapsing. The next question is important because it's something we experience, many of us experience in our lives quite a lot. And that's when somebody seems to suddenly lose the plot politically in a way that really affects their personal life, the life of loved ones and family too, because it might be that somebody has gone, let us say, from a center-left position to soft fascism overnight, and you feel that person is spiraling, and you don't know what to do, and you don't recognize them, but yet you love them, and they're at the center of your life. What do you do? This is an anonymous story, and I've only got a kind of snippet summary of it, which is a lot less evocative than the real thing, but let's put it on the table and just say a couple of things about it. So we have a story of a close family member who voted Obama, but then turned to Trump in 2016, having also been sympathetic to Bernie. And that family member experienced their political floating around as a deep struggle with much confusion, quite a bit of mental health vulnerability, and unsureness of why they were on this compulsive and partly self-destructive path. They had problems online because they wanted to say things that aren't allowed to be said by the social media apps we've got. And then there was a shift back and a kind of a recalibration to back where that person was. But this journey was, I think, very painful for everybody involved, and of course hellish for loved ones too. So there's no way I want to give any advice to the author of that story, but I wanted to use that story to make a couple of general comments, because I think it's a story that is happening in a lot of households, more in the United States than in Europe, but in Europe too. And I just wanted to gently put down on the table a few things. The first is intimacy. The importance of intimacy when somebody is beginning to float off in a direction that looks self-destructive. I got told a story the other day by a therapist I know, and the story was done and sort of shared in this outline that was sufficiently abstract to not impinge on the privacy of the client. But the story was roughly that there was a client who this therapist had, and this therapist isn't a psychoanalyst. He offers strategic advice to clients. But basically, one of the clients was a woman who had a daughter in her late teens, and that daughter, who was about 18, got into a relationship with somebody who was in prison. And it's not always a bad idea to be in a relationship with somebody who was in prison, but let's assume in this case it was. And the advice was, when she wants to go and visit him in jail, drive her. And you're going to be with her for 3 hours, and he's going to be with her for half an hour. And as you establish this position of intimacy with her over this issue, she will herself begin sharing how she is experiencing the challenges of this situation. And you won't need to leverage her out of that situation. She will enter into a deep dialogue with you about it that will be visceral and loving and vulnerable. And then you will have much more leverage over her than if you just began telling her off and telling her to get to the damn prison herself. This is important, and I believe in that. I think this is easier when you're dealing with a kid. I think it's particularly traumatic when you're dealing with a partner, somebody you've been with for a long time, who you suddenly find unrecognizable because they've swung from one extreme to another, let us say. or swung from some reasonable place to an extreme. But nevertheless, I think intimacy is important. The second thing that I think is really important is to accept that very often this needs to be a conversation that's got nothing to do with politics. It's a conversation that might involve that person getting therapy, if they're open to it. And it's a conversation that needs to be really, handled in terms of what that person's relationship is with their mother, what their issues are coming out of childhood. And it might be that it's not about politics at all. Because, various kinds of psychopathology can mean that one's political views are toxic. Moreover, it's actually possible to hold very benign and constructive political views, but in a toxic way. So, very importantly, sometimes this needs to be a conversation that just keeps politics out, even though it seems to be a political sort of journey that somebody is on, a destructive political journey. But if it is a conversation about politics, I think that it can then go in two directions. This is the third thing I put on the table. It can go toward what feelings of political alienation and distrust that person is experiencing. And there is a video outlining 4 feelings of political distrust on the main channel. It's a 5-minute video. And I think that that's an important place to go to. So what are you feeling? Are you feeling like you've been betrayed? Are you feeling just disempowered? Are you feeling lost? What is it? That's important. And then the second thing that's important, if it is a political conversation, is to abstract away from particular parties, particular candidates, particular political movements, and just talk about things that are negatives to be avoided and things that are toxic for democracy. Because very often that person will be able to identify with these things and agree on them if you abstract it from a political movement that they're attached to. So, you will often get people who favor political candidate Bob, and let's say Bob doesn't care about democracy, Bob doesn't want an independent judiciary, a free media, elections where folks can get voted out. And what happens is that a lot of Bob's voters will in general say, oh yes, elections do need to be opportunities to substitute our government. We do need an independent judiciary. We do need an independent media. But then they support Bob, who is against all of these things. So it can sometimes be very helpful to say, well, look, let's just pick out 10 things that are parasitic upon democracy and agree with them. I think that's it for this comment. But I just think this is something we're going to come back to, because I think this is happening in a lot of families. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to have at least begun this sort of conversation with all of us. Our next question comes from signoguns, and it's, did you see Putin compare himself to Pete the Great the other day? So Putin had a meeting with young startup folks who were very freaked out. In the footage we saw, they didn't know where they were, and they almost found the whole experience unintelligible. But Putin talked about, in connection with that event, he talked about Peter the Great, as well as technological, economic, and I think political, some other kind of sovereignty for Russia. But a guy called Peskov, who is not the Peskov there is another Peskov with the same name, who is a special representative of Putin. And he released an ideological piece, adding another kind of sovereignty, which is absolutely hysterical. Cognitive sovereignty, defined as being adequately immune from inappropriate foreign influences that convey values and arguments that aren't suitable to properly self-understanding authentic Russians. Oh my God. Cognitive sovereignty. Anyway, so Putin appeared relatively healthy looking in that event, very coherent, and disturbingly sincere about this whole historical stuff, which is why you're going to need something like cognitive sovereignty to get the population to buy into Putin's imagery to any extent, because it's so absurd. But yes, Putin is comparing himself to Peter the Great, and he is talking about historical antecedents of not even land acquisition, but land reacquisition, as Putin sees it, reacquiring the lands that are appropriately ours. Now, don't forget, this is not Putin's main project, so let's not confuse ourselves and think that Putin is after a designated bit of territory he wants to gain and then he stops. No, Putin has got an escalation pattern that he's on, and that pattern is not specific to particular territories. It's just about escalating dynamics against NATO and the West. Our next question comes from Bojan, and Bojan asks, why in politics is morality and ethics something that just gets hit as something bad and shameful? Why can't we take a morally proper view of politics and not settle for grossly immoral things happening without us being able to call them out for what they are? I think that there are two extreme positions that we've got to look at and dismiss. One's the view that ethics has no place in politics at all, that ethics is just froth atop a glass to just be blown away to reveal the real political substance beneath. And that's obviously a kind of realist view that it's wrong. I mean, just look at the political outrage, the moral outrage of Europeans and North Americans too, and others around the world at the Ukraine war. And that moral outrage then drove political decisions. Western citizens put pressure on their governments to do more. Here's morality and politics mixing. So the idea that ethics has no place in politics is ridiculous. But the idea that politics can be all about ethics is also ridiculous. That's the idea that politics can be kind of applied ethics applied to the political sphere. You could just about get away thinking that if you were a local councillor. But in high power politics, ethics should always be one consideration among others, but it can never be the only consideration. Sometimes it'll be the main consideration, sometimes ethics will be consideration number 5. But what you're wanting from your politicians is a situation where ethics is part of it. It's always one consideration among others. It doesn't disappear, but it doesn't just become a kind of situation where a politician is trying to apply ethical principles and dispositions to practice, because that's just not a coherent enterprise. So why is it not a coherent enterprise? Well, values conflict. So in high-powered politics, even if you're doing a brilliant job, you're going to be choosing between justice and mercy, between justice and peace, between freedom and equality. So you're going to do a lot of bad things just because the positive ends of politics clash. Then, more importantly perhaps, you can't do high-powered politics without doing evil things, or bad things at least, every day. Without participating in alliances with ghastly people, without making policy that is in many ways ethically reprehensible, without indeed even killing people. You can't be the president of the United States without killing a lot of people and ruining a lot of people's lives. Yeah, there's no way that if Bernie Sanders were president, or whoever it is you support, it doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Jill Stein, it doesn't matter. If they're in high power, they're going to be in this necessary way, in a position of having dirty hands. You can't have high power politics without that. And that's why Barack Obama said about himself that he's a president who's good at killing. And what he meant by that is, he was talking about the drone program, is that here was a guy who had a moral compass, as he thinks of himself, who could still sit on a Tuesday and write down the list of people who were going to be killed, extrajudicially killed across the world by the United States, and many civilians would innocently be killed with them too. And Obama could make these kill lists and then sleep. And most importantly, he could do this without losing a sense of a moral compass. So he still reflected deeply on the decisions he took. He reflected on why the list was of a certain size, not bigger. He reflected on how involved he was with this list instead of just delegating it elsewhere. So what he was really trying to say is, for somebody with a moral compass, he is a man with a talent for doing bad things and still being able to function. Most humans would not be able to do what Obama was doing without turning either nutty or horrendous. Yeah, and Obama believes he could. This is something that I'm stating as a psychological observation, totally independently of what you think of the drone program, what you think of Obama. These issues are not relevant at the moment. But we're talking about the capacity to make decisions that are very, very painful, very costly to a lot of people, and even costly to people's lives. And in high-powered politics, you just cannot get rid of the problem of dirty hands. If you want to do politics without it, be a local councillor and change the speed limits in your area. Oh, look, I mean, are we facing a crisis of ethics just slipping out of politics altogether? God, yeah. Absolutely, and we will be talking about that. But speaking in an abstract terms, what you always want is a situation where ethics is an important consideration, but one consideration among others in politics. That's the best you can do in high-powered politics. So that's the answer. Iaroslav asks, what do you think about the idea that the West to some degree brought Putin up by presumably just allowing global capital in all kinds of grey and more grey and less grey ways to interlink with the Putin regime? Absolutely. I think there's a hell of a lot in this. And going forward, the West needs to make a decision about how far to interlink itself into the future with the Putin regime. Is it a lot less? Is it nothing? Is it zero? Where are we going to draw that line? That's very, very important because we have brought Putin up to think that there are all kinds of things that he can do, that he can take ex-leaders of Western states and put them on the board of, corrupt state Russian corporations. So certainly there's a role for, to speak in cartoonish terms, global capital interlinking with the Putin regime. There's a role for that as an explanatory story of how part of the explanatory story of how we ended up where we are. What about the fact that you ascribe responsibility down to nations? How am I responsible if I'm just part of a nation? Can't we just talk about humans being responsible for things humans do? Why this category of the nation? Because I am committed, Iaroslav, to talking in a political way. And I think the central political community is the community of the nation state. That's the level at which we have the most palpable degree, in democracies at least, of democratic accountability. So that is the most logical way to frame one sense of political belonging, one sense of political community. And the problem with taking a cosmopolitan view of community is that, as Avishai Margalit, who you know, says, there is no politics in cosmopolitanism. And for me, it would be very problematic to talk about everybody being responsible for what Putin is doing in virtue of being a human being. I suppose you can have a certain kind of thought in that direction. You can say, what Putin shows us about being human is that we're still in a human world and in a human political reality where there are going to be leaders who do weird things for mystical reasons, for civilizational reasons. And that's always going to be part of reality, and we've got to accept that as part of the human condition. Sure. But that's different to saying that somebody, who lives in Vancouver holds political responsibility for Putin's decision to go into Ukraine the way, let us say, Alexei Navalny holds that responsibility. And then Navalny is a Russian citizen. He's responsible for what happens in Russia's politics. Of course, he's going to have a different level of responsibility to some random person from Vancouver. So that's how I would very briefly and inadequately and tentatively answer you. Next couple of questions come from Eccles and from GTR9S. Can you do a video about the minorities inside Russia in the context of the war? We might do a video on the Clips channel about that. And Eccles asks, can you share insights into Russia's cultural relationship with the East? How deep and significant is it? I think that the reason for the ethnic minorities fighting this war in such a disproportionate way is to make the war unreal for folks who live in Moscow and in Petersburg. And that's this sort of tension between Russia going totalitarian, but only partly, and still significantly staying a hybrid informational autocracy, which really means that the citizens are meant to think, is this war happening? Is it not? Is it real? Is it not? Is it real? Is it not? And if abundant coffins were coming back with soldiers to Moscow and Petersburg, which isn't happening at the moment, then these big centers, cultural centers in Russia, would feel very differently about the war and would perceive its reality differently. And we have spoken on the main channel about why Russians are so depoliticized, why they're a population and not citizens. So I think that Russia's republics are interesting. There's 22 republics in Russia. And on paper, there's a kind of a federalist system in Russia. But in reality, that federalism is weak and notional. And what you often get is just people being parachuted in from the center to run local areas. And Russia really lacks an adequate and healthy degree of decentralization of this power vertical. It's both a vertical of power that exists in Russia and a kind of very ill-defined vertical of power, a kind of one that sort of melts into different shapes and sizes depending on needs and circumstances, and just randomly does so too. So Russia is nearly impossible to run at the moment with the current structure. And there isn't much power, constructive power, in the hands of folks who are running local regions. There are exceptions, and the clearest exception is, of course, Kadyrov, who is the dictator of Chechnya, and on Chechen territory, to a good extent, Russia's monopoly over organized violence doesn't apply, which is why Kadyrov can make remarks such as, if we see police people on Chechen territory that aren't from Chechnya, our police will be permitted to shoot at them. This is the sort of thing that would be completely unacceptable for the mayor of Moscow, let's say, to say about police coming from out of town. So this is the picture. I think that one of the things we're clearly going to see in the near future is not so much ethnic campaigns for independence from Russia, but ethnically mediated economic protest. And that protest will be primarily directed at the local authorities. And the Kremlin will do everything in its power to keep this protest directed to local authorities who are corrupt and put in place by the center. So the center should absolutely take responsibility for whatever happens in the regions, but it won't. So this is, I think, just a very brief comment in all of these directions. Perhaps finally, the last cartoonish thing to add is that this business of the Eurasian identity is quite shallow. It's a geographical category, sure, but there isn't much culture in it. And that's in part why Russia is so keen to assert not that it's abandoning European values, but that Europe has abandoned European values, that Europe has become narcissistic, obsessed with political correctness, absurdly individualistic. And we Russians are the true heirs of genuine European conservative values. And that's happening really because Russia can't really critique Europe without using European resources. Russia is stuck like that. The resources of European culture, European values. So I can't think of any kind of fundamental critique that Russia can make of Europe culturally, or any kind of self-critique Russia can make culturally that will not be overwhelmingly based on European resources. This is hopelessly inadequate as commentary, but I might leave it for now. Maya asks about Lenin. I'm interested in learning about Lenin and what the Bolsheviks did in the early years of their rule. Was this the closest that Russia ever got to something democratic? And was it any different than previous power structures that the Bolsheviks overthrew? Maya, my answer is pessimistic here. Lenin was a dictator and a gangster. He was a psychopath. He was certainly not as bad as Stalin on paper, and may never have been as bad as Stalin if he lived longer. But who knows? You know, Lenin issued edicts like round up 100 kulaks, rich peasants, and kill them so that the people will fear, so that the people will tremble. So he had plenty of blood on his hands and would have been delighted to take on more blood. So his chief legacy is to create a one party, one ideology state. So the democracy promoting credentials of Lenin's ideas and of Lenin's behavior in practice are spectacularly low. And the Leninist adaptations of Marxism made whatever democracy promoting credentials Marxism had lower. Lenin, for instance, dramatized and incorporated the stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat into the story of how the revolution occurs. So I'm afraid that Lenin and democracy are things that on the whole point pretty much in opposite directions. This is just a quick comment because there's a wonderful remark here by Zeitgeist about just the difficulty of arguing with people you desperately dislike and the difficulty of sharing political space with them. And I just want to say how important it is that we keep talking to people we don't like, that we keep sharing the table of politics with people who are fellow citizens, who might be very, very unlikable to our taste, but that we only kick them out or ourselves get up and leave if there's a threat of violence. But that short of that, we need to understand that when we pretend that we expel people from the table of politics, we're actually just expelling ourselves into a kind of denial, the kind of denial young kids do when they play hide and seek and they go like this and think they're invisible. Closing a door to a room doesn't make the room go away, doesn't make the people in that room go away. And politics is eating a lot of manure very often, and that's the way it's always going to be. Sipakko asks, what do you think about EU federalization even after Brexit? So there is the idea of economic union that's been a big part of how we think of the European project, but there is also the idea of political union. And there's much debate historically about whether you can have one without the other. I am a skeptic about the European Union, even though I am not a Brexiteer kind of skeptic. I'm a very committed Remainer in terms of my personal political preference, but I'm a Remainer who is skeptical about the European Union. I remember I wrote something over 20 years ago suggesting that the euro wouldn't exist by 2030. Young kid pushing my luck. But that's the trend in which I see the European Union. I think we're going to have a process of basically slow disintegration of the European Union over the next quarter and half century. And I actually think that that's not a good thing, but I think that that's where we're at. And there's all kinds of connections, unfortunately, between the loss of trust in democratic institutions and the EU. In other words, there's a risk that for all of the brilliant things that the EU alone can do, the very existence of the EU is conducive to a diminution of trust in institutions, because people see institutions that aren't part of their countries potentially having some influence over their lives. There's a lot of magical thinking about this, there's a lot of nonsense about this, but nevertheless, I think that there's a kind of unfortunate relationship between the rise of the anti-democratic right and the sustenance of the European Union, and I don't think that tension can ever be broken. I think that tension will only increase. My position is to be loving of the European Union. I mean, my identity is completely European. I'm in Britain, I'm a British citizen, but I live in a European city as far as I'm concerned. And my neighboring cities are not just, Brighton, Liverpool, Bristol. They're also Lyon, Munich, and so on. So that's how I feel. But unfortunately, I think that I'm pessimistic tendentiously about the European Union without predicting anything catastrophic. But I'm seeing a pattern of disintegration as our destination, not integration. Emma asks, I'm a mum of 2 boys and a carer of 2 boys with autism, and I often worry and think of how many folks there are in Ukraine with learning disabilities and severe disabilities in general, how we can help them. I'm going to attach a list with some links of ways to support folks with disabilities in Ukraine. I'm sure you're aware of all of this, so I doubt I'll be adding any value, saying anything new, but I'm going to link that up below the video. And we've got to be honest that even though we in the West have a very long way to go to understand autism properly and to understand the kind of challenge it presents to individuals, kids with autism, to family members, to parents, the kind of challenge it presents to us as a society in terms of facilitating folks with autism to make the contribution they can make if we arrange things in a conducive way for them. We don't understand what big stuff autism in families is. And this needs to change, quite frankly, because there's other things we don't understand very well, like, for instance, certain mental health issues like depression. But we understand depression so much better than we understand autism. And of course, I think all of this will be in a much worse place in Ukraine. I think disability consciousness will be in a mess in Ukraine. I think there's going to be a lot of folks with disabilities and a lot of folks with autism who are having a more difficult time than they otherwise would during this war, which wouldn't be easy for anybody. But I think that there's a lot of folks who are not getting the support or the comprehension in the society in which they live that they deserve. I'm speaking banalities, but I think banalities are sometimes really, really important. And we'll come back to talking about what it means to make our societies more friendly to people with different kinds of disabilities, and how we melt down these prejudices and often end up in win-win situations whereby we support folks and in turn folks are then liberated to make remarkable contributions to society that they couldn't make if we had remained unaccommodating and prejudiced. Our next question is from a lovely Patreon supporter. And what is going on with Russia's hatred of Poland? Where does it come from? Look, I might do a separate discussion of this on the Clips channel. So we will talk then about why, Poland has suffered this extraordinary fate of being on wheels as a country, and why there's such an unlovely history there with the Russian Empire. But let me just say something about very, very recent history. When I was living in the Soviet Union, Poland was idealized. If somebody said they got a pair of shorts that were Polish, or they got some kind of, makeup that was Polish, people would say, wow, amazing. As they would if it was Czech or from Yugoslavia. These countries were elevated as being on a different different level of civilization and sophistication and taste. So in the 80s, we very much looked up to Poland, and it is a bit more complex than what I'm making it out to be, but there was this kind of high regard. I think then, in the 90s and on, there was the feeling that Poland began drifting in the wrong direction, that Poland began drifting west, Poland began drifting toward the European Union, and that Poland has become a kind of, sellout. It's become part of the American empire, part of NATO, whatever else. And I think there is that kind of perception, that kind of feeling, that kind of resentment that doesn't take Poland's agency seriously enough, doesn't take Poland's, right to decide its own destiny. And that's part of Russia's sort of series of complex empire withdrawal syndrome symptoms. So I think that we have swung from this sort of positive regard in the 80s to now ordinary Russians in a high abundance being able to, not wholly seriously, but half seriously, sort of answer a poll in the affirmative about whether it'd be a good thing to attack Poland or even attack Poland with unconventional weapons. So there we go. I have, by the way, just as much Polish blood as Russian or Ukrainian. So there we go. Nick asks, Vlad, what is the meaning of life? Love. There are different kinds of love. 170 different kinds of love. But for me, there are two types of love. There's one type of love that's about individuals I love, people I love in my life. And that kind of goes in this direction. And then there is the love I have for philosophy and art and music, and it goes in this direction. And they don't meet. They pull in opposite directions, but they counterbalance each other in a very wonderful way. So there is the love I have for people I love, and then there is the love I have for, Beethoven and Nietzsche. And that's what life's about for me. And I actually think these couple of YouTube channels are also about love in a way, because we're having a conversation that tries to put the concerns of the audience first, which might not be true for the philosophy channel. And I do think that this is about love. Even this channel is about love. What I don't think is that there is some kind of a single meaning of life that the people are waiting to discover. And here, let me just see if I can remember a line from Alexander Herzen, the great 19th century Russian thinker, who said something like, where is life before it's lived? Nowhere is the answer. You create life, you make life by living it day by day. So there isn't a kind of libretto that we're discovering, or a hidden meaning, or a cosmic meaning, in my view, that we're discovering. But if you had to have one word, love. Next question comes from Max Fleming. And I think what you're really asking is, how do we balance this business of individual freedom or individual autonomy and identity, self-identity, with family, community, country, and see our own personal individual life in the context of these wider concerns? How can we find a better balance in a socio-political context between, let us say, forms of collectivism that go wrong and a healthy kind of sense of the value of disadvantaged folks, the value of everybody who is a citizen, and how do we balance that versus, the individual? So I think values clash, and I think that in our society there are always going to be conflicts between the values of freedom and the values of equality. And I say plural because I think that equality and freedom express themselves in different ways. So there are many conceptions of equality that have a big role in our society and are part of a healthy discourse. We don't want to reduce them to a single conception of equality. It's not going to work anyway. We don't want to reduce our conceptions of freedom or justice just to a single conception. We need as much as possible to, as it were, have our, cake and eat it. So beyond a certain point, you can't transcend that conflict. You will be reducing liberties when you create more equality in many cases, not always, but in many cases. Then I would say that there are certain principles that we can put down on the table that I think are really important. Here is one. The idea that you take seriously that people shouldn't be made to pay for bad things that happen to them that are simply a product of bad luck. Like, for example, getting ill out of the blue. That we as a society should support people through these circumstances. And that doesn't necessarily take you to any particular political policy. So that's not even a left or a center-left view I'm expressing. It's compatible with being conservative. So certain principles like this can be put down. And the value that I think is really important in these waters is what I call solidarity. I think solidarity is really, really important. Because it speaks to a capacity to come together while at the same time being very different and having differences and divergences in value and commitments and views of the good life. So solidarity is quite a constructive value, in my opinion. We should talk about it more. I do think that there is a problem, though, and of course there are many problems, but one of the problems is that we are having a crisis of trust in political institutions. And when you have crises of trust, the degree to which citizens want to put in place a safety net that holds up all citizens above a certain threshold diminishes. And we've got a real problem with this. And one of the things we have seen historically, actually, is that the countries that were the most mono-ethnic were the countries that did best at generating and sustaining a very rich and generous welfare state. Because if you and I don't see eye to eye, if you and I feel like we come from different cultures and I don't like yours and you don't like mine, we're much less likely to be committed to offering each other via the institutions of the state that we share various kinds of basic goods, basic safety nets, basic welfare that will protect us from the burden of bad things that might happen to us through no fault of our own. A very inadequate answer, but just the beginning of some of the threads of conversation that just lead lead forward and open up when we touch on these waters. Next question comes from Philip Robinson. And Vlad, could you do a video at some point on dedovschina, the hazing and sort of systemic abuse and humiliation of junior ranks in the Russian army, and also on vory, the Russian mafia that arose from the gulags? From what I have read, if I were in Russia, I would do everything in my power to avoid entering the military. Well, the problem is that it is genuinely a socioeconomic lift for some of the most disadvantaged communities in Russia, and a lot of them just do it for money, quite frankly. Now, I think that what I should do is just direct you to Mark Galeotti. I'm not sure if you know his work, but I'm going to attach, I think, one of Mark's many YouTube presentations, and Mark wrote a book called Vory just on this topic, and he's better than me at covering it. But certainly there is this absolutely fascinating role in the Soviet period for, if you like, basically dodgy mafia-like groupings who are basically accepted as being part of the system and part of a kind of a glue that made the system work. And this is absolutely fascinating. These people had very privileged positions in the gulag. They helped a lot of things work. I mean, even when I was growing up in the Soviet Union in the 80s, you could feel some of it. I mean, there were people who could organize some alcohol for your wedding when alcohol was banned. You know, there were people who could get you a doctor's appointment even. I mean, you needed to get in touch with some kind of a quasi-gangster underground organization to get you to skip a queue, to get a medical appointment. So this is all a fascinating story, and its contemporary incarnations are important too, because while the Putin regime is not a mafia state, it's got these remarkable sort of networks of connection and dependence with various kinds of essentially mafia practices. So I kindly direct you to Mark Galeotti, and I hope that's okay. I'm going to link up a chat by him below. Fiona asks several questions, but I want to start by clarifying something that Fiona also picked up that I said about Anne Applebaum in one of the last Q&As, where I said that Anne's formidable and is a wonderful role model for women, whatever you think of her views, because there's something special about being formidable that is hard in our culture for women. And it's hard because of the degree of prejudice that's still swimming around in our culture about women as it were, subjects of testimonial credibility. In other words, we still attribute more testimonial credibility to a man than we do to a woman. A man says, I saw this and that. We believe that a bit more than when the woman says, I saw this and that. And so the kind of scenario I'm thinking of is a woman CEO who is discussing something with her board, and somebody in the board just cuts her off and pretends that they haven't. And she might think for a fraction of a second, did this happen? Did this not happen? Did this happen? Did this not happen? The same might be said about unbounded inappropriate behavior, somebody holding her slightly inappropriately. Did this happen? Did this not happen? What I'm saying is that this business of doubting that white is white and that up is up and down is down and black is black for a fraction of a second is something that happens more to women leaders than to men leaders. And the cause of that, for me, isn't something biological. It's something to do with the degree of prejudice about women as reliable testifiers that still is a big part of our culture. That's all I was making. That's all I was saying. I wasn't saying anything else. And I wasn't denying that there's all kinds of reasons why people doubt themselves, and that women can make women doubt themselves, and so on. But what I'm saying is that it's the situation of being really formidable 100% all the way, so that you will never, even for a fraction of a second, doubt that up is up and down is down, is a greater achievement in our culture for a woman than it is for a man. You might still find that problematic, Fiona, but I take this to be a very, very basic empirical fact. What about the fate of the Ukrainian prisoners and the fate of the Azov prisoners of war? Putin is somebody who likes to make slow decisions, and Putin is going to make a slow decision with a view to milking whatever chips he has got in his hands to the maximum. I think the only observation I would make here is that Putin's motivation to free Russian soldier prisoners of war is relatively low. He's not desperate to get these people back. He'd like to, but he's not desperate. And he's not desperate because he doesn't care that much about individual lives compared to the Ukrainian government. So that's one big asymmetry. Will Ukraine get Crimea back? At the moment, Russia's position is that an attack on Crimea is like an attack on Moscow. And as long as that's Russia's position, Ukraine would need to take Moscow to get Crimea. This might change, and there could be something grey that happens, that Ukraine goes for Crimea in some kind of delimited way, but this would require some kind of astronomically positive scenario for Ukraine. So under normal circumstances, no, Ukraine cannot get Crimea back. Moreover, Western support won't be as full-on for Ukraine if it tries to get Crimea back. A lot of Western leaders will dramatically scale down their support for Ukraine if they're supposed to support Ukraine, not just pushing Russia out of the pre-February 24 areas, but grabbing back Crimea from Russia. So Crimea is a really difficult one. What do Putin's daughters think? Who knows? Who knows? Putin is unlucky in his own mind to not have a son he has groomed to replace him. That would be a typical pattern in that part of the world. What I would suspect is that Putin's daughters are possibly less critical of the regime and of the situation than the daughters of other people among the elites. I mean, we're aware that a lot of these kids are dreadfully unhappy with what's happening, and they're very unhappy with their fathers, basically, for participating in this. And little by little, this will be coming out. How has Putin degenerated so much? What would his parents think of him now? Look, it's very difficult for anybody to not degenerate. This is one of the conversations I often have with my journalist friend Anita McNaught, because Anita's been in so many countries with ghastly dictatorships, and she's witnessed these kinds of degeneration. And she has a rule of thumb that nobody can survive 15 years and be sane. And Putin is long past that. So I never liked Putin, I must say. I disliked him from the beginning as a political candidate. But there is no doubt that he massively degenerated, that he has lost touch with reality, that he has been surrounded by unfortunate people and came to trust them, and has been progressively really severed from sophisticated people with a good sense of reality being around him. But there's a really serious process of degeneration, and it's very worryingly revealed in this thing we mentioned earlier, this gathering he had with the startup folks, where he was with utmost sincerity aligning himself with Peter the Great and talking about the inevitability of his Ukraine invasion. He is very, 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 very sincere on this. Lorem Ipsum asks, what's your view of a particular interview clip of Adam Curtis discussing what he thinks of Western politics? And what are the similarities between what's happening in Russia and what may or may not be happening in the West? Well, look, let me make a couple of remarks on the Curtis clip, and I'll make them sort of freestanding for anybody who hasn't seen interviews with Adam Curtis. I made a note, actually, of a couple of points I want to pick out that Curtis made. He said that modern authenticity can be a kind of prison. That's a fascinating thought. And where I take that thought is that authenticity is a real value, and everybody strives for it in our society, but that it's very often terribly materialistically and poorly expressed. But that doesn't mean that the value isn't real. It just means that its expression in our culture is kind of deformed and distorted. And then Curtis says the sign of a great ideology is it doesn't look like an ideology to one. I think there is a lot to that. For instance, there is an idea in the West that mirrors the idea that was present in the Eastern Bloc, that the state should do everything, the state does things best. The mirror idea of that is that the market does everything best. And that's a kind of magical thinking that's present in the West that can often masquerade the fact that it is in fact an ideology, and a silly ideology. Is that what does what best is a contingent question. There's no such thing as saying the market does things best. That's a ridiculous thing to say. The market does plenty of things best, but in each case we need to see. So another expression of this sort of business of ideology masquerading is what we might call scientism, the idea that science answers all fundamental questions that need answering, or will answer them in principle, is obviously a wrong idea, because a lot of questions are not scientific questions, and science is limitlessly marvelous and should be at the center of our culture and celebrated. But scientism is the idea that the scientific method should be applied to areas that it shouldn't be applied to. And that often can manifest as a kind of ideology that people who are stuck in it can't question. And hence you have, Brett Weinstein on his platform trying to explain the beginning of the Second World War via evolutionary means and via explanations from evolutionary psychology that, of course, is hysterically funny. I would say that there are two possibilities about politics. That's a thought I had listening to what Curtis was saying. One, and we've got to be very clear about this, that one possibility is that we make our politics better. One possibility is that we lose what we have. And we have to keep both of these scenarios in mind. I think there's a lot of folks who are not understanding the fact that we've got a lot of problems in our society that are systemic and that need to be challenged and addressed. And they keep going around saying how lucky we are, to have what we've got, and that's not right. We need to address systematic problems. On the other hand, there are people who just think about how disastrous our situation is and how there are all of these problems, not realizing that you can slide far, far back from where we are. We can be, hopefully, in a position to acknowledge both of these possibilities. Things can get better, but things can also get worse. And our conversation about democratic decline is a conversation about things getting worse. I think that's all I'm going to say about Adam Curtis, and briefly to remark on what similarities there are between Russia and the West. Well, look, if a democracy begins to slide, it might slide from being Britain to being Poland, and from being Poland to being Hungary, and from being Hungary to being, let us say, Russia 5 years ago, and from being Russia 5 years ago to Belarus today. So that's absolutely a trajectory that is available, and it's a trajectory that we've got to avert. In terms of various kinds of methods of politics that are parasitic upon democracy, that are being spread all over the West. I think the thought we've got to keep in mind about that is that some of it is actually orchestrated and borders on a kind of conspiracy, and is a set of networks where folks are cooperating internationally and trying to get certain patterns going in our politics, and the Russians love fueling all of this. But on top of it happening in a quite sort of contrived and deliberate way, it's also happening organically. And the organic process is actually much bigger, much more powerful. That there are various kinds of organic forms of political disease, if you like, that are distributing themselves across our world. And we've got to be sensitive to those and respond to them adequately. Thank you so much for getting through this Q&A. If you have, it's a heroic achievement. Lots of love until next time.